Hey, everybody. Part 8 of Creative Evolution by Henri Bergson, starting on page 220. You may recall he was talking about, just to pick it up, that there's no definite system of mathematical laws at the base of nature, and because mathematics in general represents simply the side to which matter inclines. He was talking about this little cork doll. Put one of those little cork dolls with leaden feet in any posture, lay it on its back, turn it up on its head, throw it into the air. It will always stand itself up again automatically. So likewise with matter, we can take it by any end and handle it in any way, and it will always fall back into some of our mathematical formulae because it is weighted with geometry. So that was where we left off with the last reading. But the philosopher will perhaps refuse to found a theory of knowledge on such considerations. They will be repugnant to him because the mathematical order, being order, will appear to him to contain something positive. It is in vain that we assert that this order produces itself automatically by the interruption of the inverse order, that it is this very interruption. The idea persists nonetheless that there might be no order at all, and that the mathematical order of things, being a conquest over disorder, possesses a positive reality. In examining this point, we shall see what a prominent part the idea of disorder plays in problems relative to the theory of knowledge. It does not appear explicitly, and that is why it escapes our attention. It is, however, with the criticism of this idea that a theory of knowledge ought to begin. For if the great problem is to know why and how reality submits itself to an order, it is because the absence of every kind of order appears possible or conceivable. It is this absence of order that realists and idealists alike believe they're thinking of. The realist, when he speaks of the regularity that objective laws actually impose on a virtual disorder of nature, the idealist, when he supposes a sensuous manifold, quote unquote, which is coordinated and consequently itself without order, under the organizing influence of our understanding. The idea of disorder, in the sense of absence of order, is then what must be analyzed first. Philosophy borrows it from daily life, and it is unquestionable that when ordinarily we speak of disorder, we're thinking of something, but of what? It will be seen in the next chapter how hard it is to determine the content of a negative idea and what illusions one is liable to, what hopeless difficulties philosophy falls into for not having undertaken this task. Difficulties and illusions are generally due to this, that we accept as final a manner of expression essentially provisional. They're due to our bringing into the domain of speculation a procedure made for practice. If I choose a volume in my library at random, I may put it back on the shelf after glancing at it and say, this is not verse. Is this what I have really seen in turning over the leaves of the book? Obviously not. I have not seen, I never shall see an absence of verse. I have seen prose. But as it is poetry I want, I express what I find as a function of what I am looking for. Instead of saying this is prose, I say this is not verse. In the same way, if the fancy takes me to read prose, I happen on a volume of verse, I shall say this is not prose, thus expressing the date of my perception, which shows me verse in the language of my expectation and attention, which are fixed on the idea of prose and will hear of nothing else. Now, if Monsieur Jourdain heard me, he would infer, no doubt, from my two exclamations that prose and poetry are two forms of language reserved for books, and that these learned forms have come and overlaid a language which was neither prose nor verse. Speaking of this thing, which is neither verse nor prose, he would suppose, moreover, that he was thinking of it. It would be only a pseudo-idea, however. Let us go further still. The pseudo-idea would create a pseudo-problem. If Monsieur Jourdain were to ask his professor of philosophy how the prose form and the poetry form have been superadded to that which possessed neither the one nor the other, and if he wished the professor to construct a theory of the imposition of these two forms upon this formless matter, his question would be absurd. And the absurdity would lie in this, that he was hypostasizing as the substratum of prose and poetry, the simultaneous negation of both, forgetting that the negation of the one consists in the affirmation of the other. Now, suppose that there are two species of order, and that these two orders are two contraries within one and the same genus. Suppose also that the idea of disorder arises in our mind whenever, seeking one of the two kinds of order, we find the other. The idea of disorder would then have a clear meaning in the current practice of life. It would objectify, for the convenience of language, the disappointment of a mind that finds before it an order different from what it wants, an order with which it is not concerned at the moment, and which, in this sense, does not exist for it. But the idea would not admit a theoretical use. So if we claim, notwithstanding, to introduce it into philosophy, we shall inevitably lose sight of its true meaning. It denotes the absence of a certain order, but to the profit of another, with which we're not concerned, only as it applies to each of the two in turn, and as it even goes and comes continually between the two, we take it on the way, or rather on the wing, like a shuttlecock between two batalores, and treat it as if it represented not the absence of the one or other order, as the case may be, but the absence of both together, a thing that is neither perceived nor conceived, a simple verbal entity. So there arises the problem of how order is imposed on disorder, form on matter. In analyzing the idea of disorder, thus subtilized, we shall see that it represents nothing at all. And at the same time, the problems that have been raised around it will vanish. It is true that we must begin by distinguishing and even by opposing one to the other two kinds of order which we generally confuse. As this confusion has created the principal difficulties of the problem of knowledge, it will not be useless to dwell once more on the marks by which the two orders are distinguished. In a general way, reality is ordered exactly to the degree in which it satisfies our thought. Order is therefore a certain agreement between subject and object. It is the mind finding itself again in things. But the mind, we said, can go in two opposite ways. Sometimes it follows its natural direction. There is then progress in the form of tension, continuous creation, free activity. Sometimes it inverts it. And this inversion, pushed to the end, leads to extension, to the necessary reciprocal determination of elements externalized each by relation to the others. In short, to geometrical mechanism. Now, whether experience seems to us to adopt the first direction or whether it is drawn in the direction of the second, in both cases we say there's order. For in the two processes, the mind finds itself again. The confusion between them is therefore natural. To escape it, different names would have to be given to the two kinds of order, and that is not easy because of the variety and variability of the forms they take. The order of the second kind may be defined as geometry, which is its extreme limit. More generally, it is that kind of order that is concerned whenever a relation of necessary determination is found between causes and effects. It evokes ideas of inertia, of passivity, of automatism. As to the first kind of order, it oscillates, no doubt, around finality, and yet we cannot define it as finality, for it is sometimes above, sometimes below. In its highest forms, it is more than finality. For of a free action or a work of art, we may say that they show a perfect order, and yet they can only be expressed in terms of ideas approximately and after the event. Life in its entirety, regarded as a creative evolution, is something analogous. It transcends finality. If we understand by finality the realization of an idea conceived or conceivable in advance, the category of finality is therefore too narrow for life in its entirety. It is, on the other hand, often too wide for a particular manifestation of life taken separately. Be that as it may, it is with the vital that we have to do here, and the whole present study strives to prove that the vital is the direction of the voluntary. We may say then that this first kind of order is that of the vital, or of the willed, in opposition to the second, which is that of the inert and the automatic. Common sense instinctively distinguishes between the two kinds of order, at least in the extreme cases. Instinctively also, it brings them together. We say of astronomical phenomenon that they manifest an admirable order, meaning by this that they can be foreseen mathematically. And we find an order no less admirable in a symphony of Beethoven, which is genius, originality, and therefore unforeseeability itself. But it is exceptional for order of the first kind to take so distinct a form. Ordinarily, it presents features that we have every interest in confusing with those of the opposite order. It is quite certain, for instance, that if we could view the evolution of life in its entirety, the spontaneity of its movement and the unforeseeability of its procedures would thrust themselves on our attention. And what we meet in our daily experience is a certain determinate living being. But what we meet in our daily experience is a certain determinate living being, certain special manifestations of life, which repeat almost forms and facts already known. Indeed, the similarity of structure that we find everywhere between what generates and what is generated, a similarity that enables us to include any number of living individuals in the same group, is to our eyes the very type of the generic. The inorganic genera seem to us to take living genera as models. Thus, the vital order, such as it is offered to us piecemeal in experience, presents the same character and performs the same function as the physical order. Both cause experience to repeat itself, both enable our mind to generalize. In reality, this character has entirely different origins of the two cases, and even opposite meanings. In the second case, the type of this character, its ideal limit, as also its foundation, is the geometrical necessity in virtue of which the same components give the same resultant. In the first case, this character involves, on the contrary, the intervention of something which manages to obtain the same total effect, although the infinitely complex elementary causes may be quite different. We insisted on this last point in our first chapter when we showed how identical structures ought to be met with on independent lines of evolution. But without looking so far, we may presume that the reproduction only of the type of the ancestor by his descendants is an entirely different thing from the repetition of the same composition of forces which yields an identical resultant. When we think of the infinity of infinitesimal elements and of infinitesimal causes that concur in the genesis of a living being, when we reflect that the absence or the deviation of one of them would spoil everything, the first impulse of the mind is to consider this army of little workers as watched over by a skilled foreman, the, quote, vital principle, unquote, which is ever repairing faults, correcting effects of neglect or absent-mindedness, putting things back in place. This is how we try to express the difference between the physical and the vital order. The former making the same combination of causes give the same combined effect, the latter securing the constancy of the effect even when there is some wavering in the causes. But that's only a comparison. On reflection, we find that there can be no foreman for the very simple reason that there are no workers. The causes and elements that physico-chemical analyses discovers are real causes and elements, no doubt, as far as the facts of organic destruction are concerned. They're then limited in number. But vital phenomena, properly so called, or facts of organic creation open up to us when we analyze them, the perspective of an analysis passing away to infinity, whence it may be inferred that the manifold causes and elements are here only views of the mind, attempting an ever closer and closer imitation of the operation of nature, while the operation imitated is an indivisible act. The likeness between individuals of the same species is thus an entirely different meaning, an entirely different origin to that of the likeness between complex effects obtained by the composition of the same causes. But in the one case as in the other, there is likeness and consequently possible generalization. And as that is all that interests us in practice, since our daily life is and must be an expectation of the same things and the same situations, it is natural that this common character, essential from the point of view of our action, should bring the two orders together, in spite of a merely internal diversity between them which interests speculation only. Hence the idea of a general order of nature everywhere the same, hovering over life and over matter alike. Hence our habit of designating by the same word and representing in the same way the existence of laws in the domain of inert matter and that of genera in the domain of life. Now, it will be found that this confusion is the origin of most of the difficulties raised by the problem of knowledge among the ancients as well as among the moderns. The generality of laws and that of genera having been designated by the same word and subsumed under the same idea, the geometrical order and the vital order are accordingly confused together. According to the point of view, the generality of laws is explained by that of genera, or that of genera by that of laws. The first view is characteristic of ancient thought, the second belongs to modern philosophy. But in both ancient and modern philosophy, the idea of generality is an equivocal idea, uniting in its denotation and in its connotation incompatible objects and elements. In both, they're grouped under the same concept, two kinds of order which are alike only in the facility that they give to our action on things. We bring together the two terms in virtue of a quite external likeness, which justifies no doubt their designation by the same word for practice, but which does not authorize us at all in the speculative domain to confuse them in the same definition. The ancients indeed did not ask why nature submits to laws, but why it is ordered according to genera. The idea of genus corresponds more especially to an objective reality in the domain of life, where it expresses an unquestionable fact, heredity. Indeed, there can only be genera where there are individual objects. Now, while the organized being is cut out from the general mass of matter by his very organization, that is to say, naturally, it is our perception which cuts inert matter into distinct bodies. It is guided in this by the interests of action, by the nascent reactions that our body indicates, that is, as we have shown elsewhere, by the potential genera that are trying to gain existence. In this, then, genera and individuals determine one another by a semi-artificial operation entirely relative to our future action on things. Nevertheless, the ancients did not hesitate to put all genera in the same rank, to attribute the same absolute existence to all of them. Reality thus being a system of genera, it is to the generality of the genera, that is, in effect, to the generality expressive of the vital order, that the generality of laws itself had to be brought. It is interesting in this respect to compare the Aristotelian theory of the fall of bodies with the explanation furnished by Galileo. Aristotle is concerned solely with the concepts high and low, own proper place, as distinguished from place occupied, natural movement, and forced movement. The physical law in virtue of which the stone falls expresses for him that the stone regains the, quote, natural place of all stones, to wit, the earth. The stone, in his view, is not quite stone as long as it is not in its normal place. Its falling back into this place, it aims at completing itself, like a living being that grows, thus realizing fully the essence of the genus stone. If this conception of the physical law were exact, the law would no longer be a mere relation established by the mind. The subdivision of matter into bodies would no longer be relative to our faculty of perceiving. All bodies would have the same individuality as living bodies, and the laws of the physical universe would express relations of real kinship between real genera. We know what kinds of physics grew out of this, and how, for having believed in a science unique and final, embracing the totality of the real and at one with the absolute, the ancients were confined, in fact, to a more or less clumsy interpretation of the physical in terms of the vital. But there is the same confusion in the moderns, with this difference, however, that the relation between the two terms is inverted. Laws are no longer reduced to genera, but genera to laws. And science, still supposed to be uniquely one, becomes altogether relative, instead of being, as the ancients wished, altogether at one with the absolute. A noteworthy fact is the eclipse of the problem of genera in modern philosophy. Our theory of knowledge turns almost entirely on the question of laws. Genera are left to make shift with laws as best they can. The reason is that modern philosophy has its point of departure in the great astronomical and physical discoveries of modern times. The laws of Kepler and of Galileo have remained for it the ideal and unique type of all knowledge. Now, a law is a relation between things or between facts. More precisely, a law of mathematical form expresses the fact that a certain magnitude is a function of one or several other variables appropriately chosen. Now, the choice of the variable magnitudes, the distribution of nature into objects and into facts, has already something of the contingent and the conventional. By admitting that the choice is hinted at, if not prescribed, by experience, the law remains nonetheless a relation, and a relation is essentially a comparison. It has objective reality only for an intelligence that represents to itself several terms at the same time. This intelligence may be neither mine nor yours. A science which bears on laws may therefore be an objective science, which experience contains in advance, in which we simply make it disgorge. But it is nonetheless true that a comparison of some kind must be effected here, impersonally, if not by anyone in particular, and that an experience made of laws, that is, of terms related to other terms, is an experience made of comparisons, which before we receive it has already had to pass through an atmosphere of intellectuality. The idea of a science and of an experience entirely relative to the human understanding was therefore implicitly contained in the conception of a science one and integral, composed of laws. Kant only brought it to light. But this conception is the result of an arbitrary confusion between the generality of laws and that of genera. Though an intelligence be necessary to condition terms by relation to each other, we may conceive that in certain cases the terms themselves may exist independently. And if, besides relations of term to term, experience also presents to us independent terms, the living genera being something quite different from systems of laws, one half at least of our knowledge bears on, quote, the thing in itself, unquote, the very reality. This knowledge may be very difficult just because it no longer builds up its own object and is obliged, on the contrary, to submit to it. However little it cuts into its object, it is into the absolute itself that it bites. We may go further. The other half of knowledge is no longer so radically, so definitely relative as certain philosophers say, if we can establish that it bears on a reality of inverse order, a reality which we always express in mathematical laws. That is to say, in relations that imply comparisons, but which lends itself to this work only because it is weighted with spatiality and consequently with geometry. Be that as it may, it is the confusion of two kinds of order that lies behind the relativism of the moderns, as it lay behind the dogmatism of the ancients. We've said enough to mark the origin of this confusion. It's due to the fact that the vital order, which is essentially creation, is manifested to us less in its essence than in some of its accidents, those which imitate the physical and geometrical order. Like it, they present to us repetitions that make generalization possible, and in that we have all that interests us. There is no doubt that life as a whole is an evolution, that is, an unceasing transformation. But life can progress only by means of the living, which are its depositories. Innumerable living beings, almost alike, have to repeat each other in space and in time for the novelty they're working out to grow and mature. It's like a book that advances towards a new edition by going through thousands of reprints with thousands of copies. There is, however, this difference between the two cases, that the successive impressions are identical, as well as the simultaneous copies of the same impression, whereas representatives of one and the same species are never entirely the same, either in different points of space or at different moments of time. Heredity does not only transmit characters, it transmits also the impetus in virtue of which the characters are modified, and this impetus is vitality itself. That is why we say that the repetition which serves as the base of our generalizations is essential in the physical order, accidental in the vital order. The physical order is, quote, automatic. The vital order is, I will not say voluntary, but analogous to the order willed, quote unquote. Now, as soon as we've clearly distinguished between the order that is, quote, willed and the order that is, quote, automatic, the ambiguity that underlies the idea of disorder is dissipated, and with it, one of the principal difficulties of the problem of knowledge. The main problem of the theory of knowledge is to know how science is possible. That is to say, in effect, why there is order and not disorder in things. that order exists as a fact. But on the other hand, disorder, which appears to us to be less than order, is, it seems, of right. The existence of order is then a mystery to be cleared up. At any rate, a problem to be solved. More simply, when we undertake to found order, we regard it as contingent, if not in things, at least as viewed by the mind. Of a thing that we do not judge to be contingent, we do not require an explanation. If order did not appear to us as a conquest over something, or as an addition to something, which something is thought to be the absence of order, ancient realism would not have spoken of a matter to which the idea superadded itself, or would modern idealism have supposed a sensuous manifold that the understanding organizes into nature. Now, it is unquestionable that all order is contingent and conceived as such. But contingent in relation to what? The reply to our thinking is not doubtful. An order is contingent and seems so in relation to the inverse order, as verse is contingent in relation to prose and prose in relation to verse. But just as all speech which is not prose is verse and necessarily conceived as verse, just as all speech which is not verse is prose and necessarily conceived as prose, so any state of things that is not one of the two orders is the other and is necessarily conceived as the other. But it may happen that we do not realize what we're actually thinking of and perceive the idea really present to our mind only through a mist of affective states. Anyone can be convinced of this by considering the use we make of the idea of disorder in daily life. When I enter a room and pronounce it to be, quote, in disorder, unquote, what do I mean? The position of each object is explained by the automatic movements of the person who has slept in the room or by the efficient causes, whatever they may be, that have caused each article of furniture, clothing, etc., to be where it is. The order in the second sense of the word is perfect. But it is order of the first kind that I am expecting, the order that a methodical person consciously puts into his life, the willed order and not the automatic. So I call the absence of this order disorder. At the bottom, all there is that is real, perceived, and even conceived in this absence of one of the two kinds of order is the presence of the other. But the second is indifferent to me. I am interested only in the first, and I express the presence of the second as a function of the first instead of expressing it, so to speak, as a function of itself by saying it is disorder. Inversely, when we affirm that we are imagining a chaos, that is to say, a state of things in which the physical world no longer obeys laws, what are we thinking of? We imagine facts that appear and disappear capriciously. First, we think of the physical universe as we know it, with effects and causes well proportioned to each other. Then, by a series of arbitrary decrees, we augment, diminish, suppress, so as to obtain what we call disorder. In reality, we have substituted will for the mechanism of nature. We've replaced the, quote, automatic order, unquote, by a multitude of elementary wills, just to the extent that we imagine the apparition or vanishing of phenomena. No doubt, for all these little wills to constitute a, quote, willed order, unquote, they must have accepted the direction of a higher will. But on looking closely at them, we see that that is just what they do. Our own will is there, which objectifies itself in each of these capricious wills in turn, and takes good care not to connect the same with the same, nor to permit the effect to be proportional to the cause. In fact, makes one simple intention hover over the whole of the elementary volitions. Thus, here again, the absence of one of the two orders consists in the presence of the other. In analyzing the idea of chance, which is closely akin to the idea of disorder, we find the same elements. When a wholly mechanical play of the causes which stop the wheel on a number makes me win, and consequently acts like a good genius careful of my interests, or when the wholly mechanical force of the wind tears a tile off the roof and throws it onto my head, that is to say, acts like a bad genius, conspiring against my person. In both cases, I find a mechanism where I should have looked for, where indeed it seems as if I ought to have found, an intention. This is what I express in speaking of chance, and of an anarchical world in which phenomena succeed each other capriciously. I should say again that it is a realm of chance, meaning that I find before me wills, or rather decrees, when what I am expecting is mechanism. Thus is explained the singular vacillation of the mind when it tries to define chance. Neither efficient cause nor final cause can furnish the definition sought. The mind swings to and fro, unable to rest between the idea of an absence of final cause and that of an absence of efficient cause, each of these definitions sending it back to the other. The problem remains insoluble. In fact, so long as the idea of chance is regarded as a pure idea without mixture of feeling, but in reality, chance merely objectifies the state of mind of one who, expecting one of the two kinds of order, finds himself confronted with the other. Chance and disorder are therefore necessarily conceived as relative. So if we wish to represent them to ourselves as absolute, we perceive that we're going to and fro like a shuttle between the two kinds of order, passing into the one just at the moment of which we might catch ourselves in the other, and that the supposed absence of all order is really the presence of both with, besides, the swaying of a mind that cannot finally rest in either. Neither in things nor in our idea of things can there be any question of presenting this disorder as the substratum of order, since it implies the two kinds of order and is made of their combination. But our intelligence is not stopped by this. By a simple sec jubeo, it posits a disorder which is an, quote, absence of order, unquote. In so doing, it thinks a word or a set of words, nothing more. If it seeks to attach an idea to the word, it finds that disorder may indeed be the negation of order, but that this negation is then the implicit affirmation of the presence of the opposite order, which we shut our eyes to because it does not interest us, or which we evade by denying the second order in its turn, that is, at bottom, by reestablishing the first. How can we speak then of an incoherent diversity which an understanding organizes? It's of no use for us to say that no one supposes this incoherence to be realized or realizable. When we speak of it, we believe we're thinking of it. Now, in analyzing the idea actually present, we find, as we've said before, only the disappointment of the mind confronted with an order that does not interest it, or a swaying of the mind between two kinds of order, or finally the idea pure and simple of the empty word that we have created by joining a negative prefix to a word which signifies itself something. But it is this analysis that we neglect to make. We omit it precisely because it does not occur to us to distinguish two kinds of order that are irreducible to one another. We said indeed that all order necessarily appears as contingent. If there are two kinds of order, this contingency of order is explained. One of the forms is contingent in relation to the other. Where I find the geometrical order, the vital was possible. Where the order is vital, it might have been geometrical. But suppose that the order is everywhere of the same kind and simply admits of degrees which go from the geometrical to the vital. If a determinate order still appears to me to be contingent, it can no longer be so by relation to an order of another kind. I shall necessarily believe that the order is contingent by relation to an absence of itself, that is to say, by relation to a state of things, quote, in which there is no order at all, unquote. And this state of things I shall believe that I am thinking of because it is implied, it seems, in the very contingency of order, which is an unquestionable fact. I shall therefore place at the summit of the hierarchy the vital order. Then, as a diminution or lower complication of it, the geometrical order. And finally, at the bottom of all, an absence of order, incoherence itself, on which order is superimposed. This is why incoherence has the effect on me of a word behind which there must be something real, if not in things, at least in thought. But if I observe that the state of things implied by the contingency of a determined order is simply the presence of the contrary order, and if by this very fact I posit two kinds of order, each the inverse of the other, I perceive that no intermediate degrees can be imagined between the two orders, and that there is no going down from the two orders to the, quote, incoherent. Either the incoherent is only a word devoid of meaning, or if I give it a meaning, it is a condition of putting incoherence midway between the two orders and not below both of them. There is not first the incoherent, then the geometrical, then the vital. There is only the geometrical and the vital, and then, by a swaying of the mind between them, the idea of the incoherent. To speak of the uncoordinated diversity to which order is superadded is therefore to commit a veritable petitio principii. For in imagining the uncoordinated, we really posit an order, or rather two. This long analysis was necessary to show how the real can pass from tension to extension and from freedom to mechanical necessity by way of inversion. It was not enough to prove that this relation between the two terms is suggested to us at once by consciousness and by sensible experience. It was necessary to prove that the geometrical order has no need of explanation, being purely and simply the suppression of the inverse order. And for that, it was indispensable to prove that suppression is always a substitution and is even necessarily conceived as such. It is the requirements of practical life alone that suggest to us here a way of speaking that deceives us both as to what happens in things and as to what is present to our thought. We must now examine more closely the inversion whose consequences we've just described. What then is the principle that is only to let go its tension? We may say to detend in order to extend. The interruption of the cause here being equivalent to a reversal of the effect. For want of a better word, we have called it consciousness. But we do not mean the narrowed consciousness that functions in each of us. Our own consciousness is the consciousness of a certain living being placed in a certain point in space. Though it does indeed move in the same direction as its principle, it is continually drawn the opposite way, obliged, though it goes forward, to look behind. This retrospective vision is, as we have shown, the natural function of the intellect and consequently of distinct consciousness. In order that our consciousness shall coincide with something of its principle, it must detach itself from the already made and attach itself to the being made. It needs that, turning back on itself and twisting on itself, the faculty of seeing should be made to be one with the act of willing, a painful effort which we can make suddenly, doing violence to our nature, but cannot sustain more than a few moments. In free action, when we contract our whole being in order to thrust it forward, we have the more or less clear consciousness of motives and of impelling forces, and even at rare moments of the becoming by which they are organized into an act. But the pure willing, the current that runs through this matter, communicating life to it, is a thing which we hardly feel, which at most we brush lightly as it passes. Let us try, however, to install ourselves within it, if only for a moment. Even then, it is an individual and fragmentary will that we grasp. To get to the principle of all life, as also of all materiality, we must go further still. Is it impossible? No, by no means. The history of philosophy is there to bear witness. There is no durable system that is not, at least in some of its parts, vivified by intuition. Dialectic is necessary to put intuition to the proof, necessary also in order that intuition should break itself up into concepts and so be propagated to other men. But all it does often enough is to develop the result of that intuition which transcends it. The truth is, the two procedures are of opposite direction. Same effort by which ideas are connected with ideas causes the intuition which the ideas were storing up to vanish. The philosopher is obliged to abandon intuition once he has received from it the impetus, and to rely on himself to carry on the movement by pushing the concepts one after another. But he soon feels he has lost foothold. He must come into touch with intuition again. He must undo most of what he has done. In short, dialectic is what ensures the agreement of our thought with itself. But by dialectic, which is only a relaxation of intuition, many different agreements are possible, while there is only one truth. Intuition, if it could be prolonged beyond a few instants, would not only make the philosopher agree with his own thought, but also all philosophers with each other. Such as it is, fugitive and incomplete, it is in each system what is worth more than the system and survives it. An object of philosophy would be reached if this intuition could be sustained, generalized, and above all, assured of external points of reference in order not to go astray. To that end, a continual coming and going is necessary between nature and mind. When we put back our being into our will and our will itself into the impulsion it prolongs, we understand, we feel that reality is a perpetual growth, a creation pursued without end. Our will already performs this miracle. Every human work in which there is invention, every voluntary act in which there is freedom, every movement of an organism that manifests spontaneity brings something new into the world. True, these are only creations of form. How could they be anything else? We are not the vital current itself. We are this current already loaded with matter, that is, with congealed parts of its own substance, which it carries along its course. In the composition of a work of genius, as in a simple free decision, we do indeed stretch the spring of our activity to the utmost, and thus create what no mere assemblage of materials could have given. What assemblage of curves already known can ever be equivalent to the pencil stroke of a great artist? But there are nonetheless elements here that pre-exist and survive their organization. But if a simple arrest of the action that generates form could constitute matter, are not the original lines drawn by the artists themselves already the fixation and, as it were, congealment of a movement? A creation of matter would be neither incomprehensible nor inadmissible. For we seize from within, we live at every instant a creation of form, and it is just in those cases in which the form is pure and in which the creative current is momentarily interrupted that there is a creation of matter. Consider the letters of the alphabet that enter into the composition of everything that has ever been written. We do not conceive that new letters springing up and come to join themselves to the others in order to make a new poem, but that the poet creates the poem and that human thought is thereby made richer, we understand very well. This creation is a simple act of the mind, and action has only to make a pause instead of continuing to a new creation in order that of itself it may break up into words which dissociate themselves into letters, then which are added to all the letters there are already in the world. Thus, that the number of atoms composing the material universe at a given moment should increase runs counter to our habits of mind, contradicts the whole of our experience, but that a reality of quite another order, which contrasts with the atom as the thought of the poet with the letters of the alphabet, should increase by sudden additions, is not inadmissible. And the reverse of each addition might indeed be a world, which we then represent to ourselves symbolically as an assemblage of atoms. The mystery that spreads over the existence of the universe comes in great part from this, that we want the genesis of it to have been accomplished at one stroke, or the whole of matter to be eternal. Whether we speak of creation or posited and uncreated matter, it is the totality of the universe that we are considering at once. At the root of this habit of mind lies the prejudice, which we will analyze in our next chapter, the idea common to materialists and to their opponents that there is no really acting duration and that the absolute, matter or mind, can have no place in concrete time, in the time which we feel to be the very stuff of our life. From which it follows that everything is given once for all, and that it is necessary to posit from all eternity either material multiplicity itself or the act creating this multiplicity given in block in the divine essence. Once this prejudice is eradicated, the idea of creation becomes more clear, for it is merged in that of growth. But it is no longer then the universe in its totality that we must speak. Why should we speak of it? The universe is an assemblage of solar systems which we have every reason to believe analogous to our own. No doubt they're not absolutely independent of one another. Our sun radiates heat and light beyond the farthest planet, and so, on the other hand, our entire solar system is moving in a definite direction as if it were drawn. There is then a bond between the worlds, but this bond may be regarded as infinitely loose in comparison with the mutual dependence which unites the parts of the same world among themselves, so that it is not artificially, for reasons of mere convenience, that we isolate our solar system. Nature itself invites us to isolate it. As living beings, we depend on the planet on which we are and on the sun that provides for it, but on nothing else. As thinking beings, we may apply the laws of our physics to our own world and extend them to each of the worlds taken separately, but nothing tells us that they apply to the entire universe, nor even that such an affirmation has any meaning, for the universe is not made, but is being made continually. It is growing, perhaps indefinitely, by the addition of new worlds. Let us extend then to the whole of our solar system the two most general laws of our science, principle of the conservation of energy and that of its degradation, limiting them, however, to this relatively closed system and to other systems relatively closed. Let us see what will follow. We must remark, first of all, that these two principles have not the same metaphysical scope. The first is a quantitative law and consequently relative in part to our methods of measurement. It says that in a system presumed to be closed, the total energy, that is to say, the sum of its kinetic and potential energy, remains constant. Now, if there were only kinetic energy in the world, or even if there were, besides kinetic energy, only one single kind of potential energy, but no more, the artifice of measurement would not make the law artificial. The law of the conservation of energy would express indeed that something is preserved in constant quantity. But there are, in fact, energies of various kinds, and the measurement of each of them has evidently been so chosen as to justify the principle of conservation of energy. Convention, therefore, plays a large part in this principle, although there is undoubtedly, between the variations of the different energies composing one and the same system, a mutual dependence, which is just what has made the extension of the principle possible by measurements suitably chosen. If, therefore, the philosopher applies this principle to the solar system complete, he must at least soften its outlines. The law of the conservation of energy cannot here express the objective permanence of a certain quantity of a certain thing, but rather the necessity for every change that is brought about to be counterbalanced in some way by a change in an opposite direction. That is to say, even if it governs the whole of our solar system, the law of the conservation of energy is concerned with the relationship of a fragment of this world to another fragment rather than with the nature of the whole. It is otherwise with the second principle of thermodynamics. The law of the degradation of the energy does not bear essentially on magnitudes. No doubt the first idea of it arose in the thought of Carnot out of certain quantitative considerations on the field of thermic machines. Unquestionably, too, the terms in which Clausius generalized it were mathematical, and a calculable magnitude, quote, entropy, unquote, was in fact the final conception of which he was led. Such precision is necessary for practical applications, but the law might have been vaguely conceived, and if absolutely necessary, it might have been roughly formulated, even though no one had ever thought of measuring the different energies of the physical world, even though the concept of energy had not been created. Essentially, it expresses the fact that all physical changes have a tendency to be degraded into heat, and that heat tends to be distributed among bodies in a uniform manner. In this less precise form, it becomes independent of any convention. It is the most metaphysical of the laws of physics, since it points out, without interposed symbols, without artificial devices of measurements, the direction in which the world is going. It tells us that changes that are visible and heterogeneous will be more and more diluted into changes that are invisible and homogeneous, and that the instability to which we owe the richness and variety of the changes taking place in our solar system will gradually give way to the relative stability of elementary vibrations continually and perpetually repeated. Just so with a man who keeps up his strength as he grows old, but spends it less and less in actions and comes in the end to employ it entirely in making his lungs breathe and his heart beat. From this point of view, a world like our solar system is seen to be ever exhausting something of the mutability it contains. In the beginning, it had the maximum possible utilization of energy. This mutability has gone on diminishing unceasingly. Whence does it come? We might at first suppose that it has come from some other point of space, but the difficulty is only set back. And for this external source of mutability, the same question springs up. True, it might be added that the number of worlds capable of passing mutability to each other is unlimited, and that the sum of mutability contained in the universe is infinite, that there is therefore no ground on which to seek its origin or to foresee its end. A hypothesis of this kind is as irrefutable as it is indemonstrable. But to speak of an infinite universe is to admit a perfect coincidence of matter with abstract space, and consequently an absolute externality of all the parts of matter in relation to one another. We have seen above what we must think of this theory, and how difficult it is to reconcile with the idea of a reciprocal influence of all parts of matter on one another, an influence to which indeed it itself makes appeal. Again, it might be supposed that the general instability has arisen from a general state of stability, and that the period in which we are now, and in which the utilizable energy is diminishing, has been preceded by a period in which the mutability was increasing, and that the alternations of increase and diminution succeed each other forever. This hypothesis is theoretically conceivable, as has been demonstrated quite recently, but according to the calculations of Boltzmann, the mathematical improbability of it passes all imagination and practically amounts to absolute impossibility. In reality, the problem remains insoluble as long as we keep on the ground of physics. for the physicist is obliged to attach energy to extended particles, and even if he regards the particles only as reservoirs of energy, he remains in space. He would belie his role if he sought the origin of these energies in an extra-spatial process. It is there, however, in our opinion, that it must be sought. Is it extension in general that we're considering in abstracto? Extension, we said, appears only as a tension which is interrupted. Or are we considering the concrete reality that fills this extension? The order which reigns there and which is manifested by the laws of nature is an order which must be born of itself when the inverse order is suppressed. A detention of the will would produce precisely this suppression. Lastly, we find that the direction which this reality takes suggests to us the idea of a thing unmaking itself. Such, no doubt, is one of the essential characters of materiality. What conclusion are we to draw from all this, if not that the process by which this thing makes itself is directed in a contrary way to that of physical processes, and that it is therefore, by its very definition, immaterial? The vision we have of the material world is that of a weight which falls. No image drawn from matter, properly so called, will ever give us the idea of the weight rising. But this conclusion will come home to us with still greater force if we press near to the concrete reality, and if we consider no longer only matter in general, but within this matter living bodies. All our analyses show us in life an effort to remount the incline that matter descends. In that, they reveal to us the possibility, the necessity even of a process, the inverse of materiality, creative of matter by its interruption alone. The life that evolves on the surface of our planet is indeed attached to matter. If it were pure consciousness, a fortiori, if it were supraconsciousness, it would be pure creative activity. In fact, it is riveted to an organism that subjects it to the general laws of inert matter. But everything happens as if it were doing its utmost to set itself free from these laws. It has not the power to reverse the direction of physical changes, such as the principle of Carnot determines it. It does, however, behave absolutely as a force would behave, which, left to itself, would work in the inverse direction. Incapable of stopping the course of material changes downward, it succeeds in retarding it. The evolution of life really continues, as we have shown, an initial impulsion. This impulsion, which has determined the development of the chlorophyllian function in the plant and of the sensory motor system in the animal, brings life to more and more efficient acts by the fabrication and use of more and more powerful explosives. Now, what do these explosives represent if not storing up of the solar energy, the degradation of which energy is thus provisionally suspended on some of the points where it was being poured forth? The usable energy which the explosive conceals will be expended, of course, at the moment of the explosion, but it would have been expended sooner if an organism had not happened to be there to arrest its dissipation in order to retain it and save it up, as we see it today, to the point to which it was brought by a scission of the mutually complementary tendencies which it contained within itself. Life is entirely dependent on the chlorophyllian function of the plant. This means that, looked at in its initial impulsion before any scission, life was a tendency to accumulate in a reservoir, as do especially the green parts of vegetables, with a view to an instantaneous effective discharge, like that which an animal brings about, something that would have otherwise flowed away. It is like an effort to raise the weight which falls. True, it succeeds only in retarding the fall, but at least we can give us an idea of what the raising of the weight was. Let us imagine a vessel full of steam at a high pressure, and here and there in its sides a crack through which the steam is escaping in a jet. The steam thrown into the air is nearly all condensed into little droplets which fall back, and this condensation of this fall represents simply the loss of something, an interruption, a deficit. But a small part of the jet of steam subsists, uncondensed, for some seconds. It is making an effort to raise the drops which are falling. It succeeds at most in retarding their fall. So from an immense reservoir of life, jets must be gushing out unceasingly, of which each falling back is a world. The evolution of living species within this world represents what subsists of the primitive direction of the original jet and of an impulsion which continues itself in a direction the inverse of materiality. But let us not carry too far this comparison. It gives us but a feeble and even deceptive image of reality, for the crack, the jet of steam, the forming of the drops are determined necessarily, whereas the creation of a world is a free act, and the life within the material world participates in this liberty. Let us think rather of an action like that of raising the arm. Then let us suppose that the arm, left to itself, falls back, yet that there subsists in it, striving to raise it up again, something of the will that animates it. In this image of a creative action which unmakes itself, we have already a more exact presentation of matter. In vital activity, we see then that which subsists of the direct movement in the inverted movement, a reality which is making itself and a reality which is unmaking itself. Everything is obscure in the idea of creation if we think of things which are created and a thing which creates, as we habitually do, as the understanding cannot help doing. We shall show in the origin of this illusion in our next chapter. It's natural to our intellect, whose function is essentially practical, made to present to us things and states rather than changes and acts. But things and states are only views taken by our mind of becoming. There are no things, there are only actions. More particularly, if I consider the world in which we live, I find that the automatic and strictly determined evolution of this well-knit whole is action which is unmaking itself, and that the unforeseen forms which life cuts out in it, forms capable of being themselves prolonged into unforeseen movements, representing the action that is making itself. Now, I have every reason to believe that the other worlds are analogous to ours, that things happen there in the same way, and I know they were not all constructed at the same time, since observation shows me even today nebulae in course of concentration. Now, if the same kind of action is going on everywhere, whether it is that which is unmaking itself or whether it is that which is striving to remake itself, I simply express this probable similitude when I speak of a center from which worlds shoot out like rockets in a fireworks display, provided, however, that I do not present this center as a thing, but as a continuity of shooting out. God, thus defined, as nothing of the already made. He is unceasing life, action, freedom. Creation so conceived is not a mystery. We experience it in ourselves when we act freely. That new things can join things already existing is absurd, no doubt, since the thing results from a solidification performed by our understanding, and there are never any things other than those that the understanding is thus constituted. To speak of things creating themselves would therefore amount to saying that the understanding presents to itself more than it presents to itself, a self-contradictory affirmation, an empty and vain idea. But that action increases as it goes on, that it creates in the measure of its advance, is what each of us finds when he watches himself act. Things are constituted by the instantaneous cut which the understanding practices at a given moment on a flux of this kind, and what is mysterious when we compare the cuts together becomes clear when we relate them to the flux. Indeed, the modalities of creative action, insofar as it is still going on in the direction of living forms, are much simplified when they're taken in this way. Before the complexity of an organism and the practically infinite multitude of interwoven analyses and syntheses it presupposes, our understanding recoils disconcerted. That the simple play of physical and chemical forces left to themselves should have worked this marvel we find hard to believe. And if it is a profound science which is at work, how are we to understand the influence exercised on this matter without form by this form without matter? But the difficulty arises from this, that we represent statically ready-made material particles juxtaposed to one another, and also statically an external cause which plasters upon them a skillfully contrived organization. In reality, life is a movement. Materiality is the inverse movement. And each of these two movements is simple. The matter which forms a world being an undivided flux, and the undivided also the life, and undivided also the life that runs through it, cutting out in it living beings all along its track. Of these two currents, the second runs counter to the first, but the first obtains all the same something from the second. There results between them a modus vivendi, which is organization. This organization takes for our senses and for our intellect the forms of parts entirely external to other parts in space and time. Not only do we shut our eyes to the unity of the impulse, which passing through generations links individuals with individuals, species with species, and makes of the whole series of the living one single immense wave flowing under matter, over matter, but each individual itself seems to us as an aggregate of molecules, an aggregate of facts. The reason of this lies in the structure of our intellect, which is formed to act on matter from without and which succeeds by making in the flux of the real instantaneous cuts, each of which becomes in its fixity endlessly decomposable. Perceiving in an organism only parts external to parts, the understanding has the choice between two systems of explanation only, either to regard the infinitely complex and thereby infinitely well contrived organization as a fortuitous concatenation of atoms, or to relate it to the incomprehensible influence of an external force that has grouped its elements together. But this complexity is the work of the understanding. This incomprehensible is also its work. Incomprehensibility is also its work. Let us try to see, no longer with the eyes of the intellect alone, which grasps only the already made and which looks from the outside, but with the spirit. I mean, with that faculty of seeing which is immanent in the faculty of acting, and which springs up somehow by the twisting of the will on itself when action is turned into knowledge, like heat, so to say, into light. To movement, then, everything will be restored, and into movement, everything will be resolved. Where the understanding working on the image supposed to be fixed of the progressing action shows us parts infinitely manifold and an order infinitely well contrived. We catch a glimpse of a simple process, an action which is making itself across an action of the same kind which is unmaking itself, like the fiery path torn by the last rocket of a fireworks display through the black cinders of the spent rockets that are falling dead. From this point of view, the general considerations we presented concerning the evolution of life will be cleared up and completed. We will distinguish more sharply what is accidental from what is essential in this evolution. The impetus of life of which we are speaking consists in a need of creation. It cannot create absolutely because it is confronted with matter, that is to say, with a movement that is the inverse of its own, but it seizes upon this matter which is necessity itself and strives to introduce into it the largest possible amount of indetermination and liberty. How does it go to work? An animal high in the scale may be represented in a general way, we said, as a sensory motor nervous system imposed on digestive, respiratory, circulatory systems, etc. The function of these latter is to cleanse, repair, and protect the nervous system, to make it as independent as possible of external circumstances, but above all, to furnish it with energy to be expended in movements. The increasing complexity of the organism is therefore due, theoretically, in spite of innumerable conceptions, due to accidents of evolution, to the necessity of complexity in the nervous system. No doubt, each complication of any part of the organism involves many others in addition, because this part itself must live, and every change in one point of the body reverberates, as it were, throughout. The communication may therefore go on to infinity in all directions, but it is the complication of the nervous system which conditions the others in right, if not always, in fact. Now, what does the progress of the nervous system itself consist? In a simultaneous development of automatic activity and a voluntary activity, the first furnishing the second with an appropriate instrument. Thus, in an organism such as ours, a considerable number of motor mechanisms are set up in the medulla and in the spinal cord, awaiting only a signal to release the corresponding act. The will is employed in some cases in setting up the mechanism itself, and in others in choosing the mechanisms to be released, the manner of combining them, and the moment of releasing them. The will of an animal is the more effective and the more intense, the greater the number of mechanisms it can choose from, the more complicated the switchboard on which all the motor paths cross, or in other words, the more developed its brain. Thus, the progress of the nervous system assures to the act increasing precision, increasing variety, increasing efficiency, and independence. The organism behaves more and more like a machine for action, which reconstructs itself entirely for every new act, as if it were made of India rubber and could at any moment change the shape of all its parts. But prior to the nervous system, prior even to the organism properly so called, already in the undifferentiated mass of the amoeba, this essential property of animal life is found. The amoeba deforms itself in varying directions. Its entire mass does what the differentiation of parts will localize in the sensory motor system of the developed animal. Doing it only in a rudimentary manner is dispensed from the complexity of the higher organisms. There is no need here of the auxiliary elements that pass on to motor elements the energy to expend. The animal moves as a whole, and as a whole also procures energy by means of the organic substances it assimilates. Thus, whether low, high or low in the animal scale, we always find that animal life consists, one, in procuring a provision of energy, two, in expending it by means of matter, a matter as supple as possible in directions variable and unforeseen. Now, whence comes the energy? From the ingested food, for food is a kind of explosive which needs only the spark to discharge the energy it stores. Who has made this explosive? The food may be the flesh of an animal nourished on animals and so on, but in the end it is to the vegetable we always come back. Vegetables alone gather in the solar energy, and the animals do but borrow it from them, either directly or by some passing it on to others. How then has the plant stored up this energy? Chiefly by the chlorophyllian function, a chemicism sui generis of which we do not possess the key, and which is probably unlike that of our laboratories. The process consists in using solar energy to fix the carbon of carbonic acid, and thereby to store this energy as we should store that of a water carrier by employing him to fill an elevated reservoir. The water, once brought up, can set in motion a mill or a turbine as we will when we will. Each atom of carbon fixed represents something like the elevation of the weight of water, or like the stretching of an elastic thread, uniting the carbon to the oxygen and the carbonic acid. The elastic is relaxed, the weight falls back again. In short, the energy held in reserve is restored when, by a simple release, the carbon is permitted to rejoin its oxygen. So that all life, animal and vegetable, seems in its essence like an effort to accumulate energy and then to let it flow into flexible channels, changeable in shape, at the end of which it will accomplish infinitely varied kinds of works. That is what the vital impetus passing through matter would fain do all at once. It would succeed, no doubt, if his power were unlimited, or if some reinforcement could come to it from without. But the impetus is finite, and it has been given once for all. It cannot overcome all obstacles. The movement it starts is sometimes turned aside, sometimes divided, always opposed, and the evolution of the organized world is the unrolling of this conflict. The first great scission that had to be effected was that of the two kingdoms, vegetable and animal, which thus happened to be mutually complementary, without, however, any agreement having been made between them. It is not for the animal that the plant accumulates energy, and it is for its own consumption, but its expenditure on itself is less discontinuous and less concentrated, and therefore less efficacious than was required by the initial impetus of life, initially directed toward free actions. The same organism could not with equal force sustain the two functions at once, of gradual storage and sudden use. Of themselves, therefore, and without any external intervention, simply by the effect of the duality of the tendency involved in the original impetus and of the resistance opposed by matter to this impetus, the organisms leaned, some in the first direction, others in the second. To this scission there succeeded many others, hence the diverging lines of evolution, at least what is essential in them. But we must take into account retrogressions, arrests, accidents of every kind, and we must remember above all that each species behaves as if the general movement of life stopped at it instead of passing through it. It thinks only of itself. It lives only for itself. Hence the numberless struggles that we behold in nature. Hence a discord striking and terrible, but for which the original principle of life must not be held responsible. The part played by contingency in evolution is therefore great. Contingent generally are the forms adopted or rather invented. Contingent relative to the obstacles encountered in a given place and at a given moment is the dissociation of the primordial tendency into such and such complementary tendencies which create divergent lines of evolution. Contingent, the arrests and setbacks. Contingent, in large measure, the adaptations. Two things only are necessary. One, a gradual accumulation of energy, and two, an elastic canalization of this energy in variable and indeterminate directions, at the end of which are free acts. This twofold result has been obtained in a particular way on our planet, but it might have been obtained by entirely different means. It was not necessary that life should fix its choice mainly on the carbon of carbonic acid. What was essential for it was to store solar energy. But instead of asking the sun to separate, for instance, atoms of oxygen and carbon, it might, theoretically at least, and apart from practical difficulties, possibly insurmountable, have put forth other chemical elements, which would then have had to be associated or dissociated by entirely different physical means. And if the element characteristic of the substances that supply energy to the organisms had been other than carbon, the element characteristic of the plastic substances would probably have been other than nitrogen, and the chemistry of living bodies would then have been radically different from what it is. The result would have been living forms without any analogy to those we know, whose anatomy would have been different, whose physiology also would have been different. Alone, the sensory motor function would have been preserved, if not in its mechanism, at least in its effects. It is therefore probable that life goes on in other planets and other solar systems also under forms of which we have no idea, in physical conditions to which it seems to us, from the point of view of our physiology, to be absolutely opposed. If its essential aim is to catch up usable energy in order to expend it in explosive actions, it probably chooses in each solar system and on each planet, as it does on Earth, the fittest means to get this result in the circumstances with which it is confronted. That is at least what reasoning by analogy leads to, and we use analogy the wrong way when we declare life to be impossible wherever the circumstances with which it is confronted are other than those on Earth. The truth is that life is possible wherever energy descends the incline indicated by Carnot's law, and where a cause of inverse direction can retard the descent. That is to say, probably in all the worlds suspended from all the stars. We go further. It is not even necessary that life should be concentrated and determined in organisms properly so called, that is, in definite bodies presenting to the flow of energy ready-made through elastic canals. It can be conceived, although it can hardly be imagined, that energy might be saved up and then expended on varying lines running across a matter not yet solidified. Every essential of life would still be there, since there would still be slow accumulation of energy and sudden release. There would hardly be more difference between this vitality, vague and formless, and the definite vitality we know, than there is in our psychical life between the state of dream and the state of waking. Such may have been the condition of life in our nebula before the condensation of matter was complete, if it be true that life springs forward at the very moment when, as the effect of an inverse movement, the nebular matter appears. It is therefore conceivable that life might have assumed a totally different outward appearance and design forms very different from those we know. With another chemical substratum and other physical conditions, the impulsion would have remained the same, but it would have split up very differently in course of progress. And the whole would have traveled another road, whether shorter or longer, who can tell? In any case, in the entire series of living beings, no term would have been what it is now. Now, was it necessary that there should be a series or terms? Why should not the unique impetus have been impressed on a unique body which might have gone on evolving? This question arises, no doubt, from the comparison of life to an impetus, and it must be compared to an impetus because no image borrowed from the physical world can give more nearly the idea of it. But it is only an image. In reality, life is of the psychological order, and it is of the essence of the psychical to unfold a confused plurality of interpenetrating terms. In space and in space only is distinct multiplicity possible. A point is absolutely external to another point, but pure and empty unity also is met with only in space. It is that of a mathematical point. Abstract unity and abstract multiplicity are determinations of space or categories of the understanding, whichever we will, spatiality and intellectuality being molded on each other. But what is of psychical nature cannot entirely correspond with space, nor enter perfectly into the categories of the understanding. Is my own person at a given moment one or manifold? If I declare it one, inner voices arise in protest. Those are the sensations, feelings, ideas, among which my individuality is distributed. But if I make it distinctly manifold, my consciousness rebels quite strongly. It affirms that my sensations, my feelings, my thoughts are abstractions which I affect on myself, and that each of my states implies all the others. I am then, we must adopt the language of the understanding, since only the understanding has a language, a unity that is multiple, and a multiplicity that is one. But unity and multiplicity are only views of my personality taken by an understanding that directs its categories at me. I enter neither into one, nor into the other, nor into both at once, although both united may give a fair imitation of the mutual impenetration and continuity that I find at the base of my own self. Such is my inner life, and such also is life in general. While in its contact with matter, life is comparable to an impulsion or an impetus, regarded in itself, it is an immensity of potentiality, a mutual encroachment of thousands and thousands of tendencies, which nevertheless are thousands and thousands only when once regarded as outside of each other, that is, when spatialized. Contact with matter is what determines this dissociation. Matter divides actually what was but potentially manifold. And in this sense, individuation is in part the work of matter, in part the result of life's own inclination. Thus, a poetic sentiment which bursts into distinctive verses, lines, and words may be said to have already contained this multiplicity of individuated elements, and yet, in fact, it is the materiality of language that creates it. But through the words, lines, and verses runs the simple inspiration which is the whole poem. So among the dissociated individuals, one life goes on moving. Everywhere the tendency to individualize is opposed and at the same time completed by an antagonistic and complementary tendency to associate, as if the manifold unity of life, drawn in the direction of multiplicity, made so much the more effort to withdraw itself onto itself. A part is no sooner detached than it tends to reunite itself, if not to all the rest, at least to what is nearest to it. Hence, throughout the whole realm of life, a balancing between individuation and association. Individuals join together in a society, but the society, as soon as formed, tends to melt the associated individuals into a new organism so as to become itself an individual, able in its turn to be part and parcel of a new association. At the lowest degree of the scale of organisms, we already find veritable associations, microbial colonies, and in these associations, according to a recent work, a tendency to individuate by the constitution of a nucleus. Same tendency is met with again at a higher stage in the protophytes, which, once having quitted the parent cell by way of division, remain united to each other by the gelatinous substance that surrounds them. Also in those protozoa, which begin by mingling their pseudopodia and end up by welding themselves together. The colonial theory of the genesis of higher organisms is well known. The protozoa, consisting of one single cell, are supposed to have formed by assemblage aggregates, which, relating themselves together in their turn, have given rise to aggregates of aggregates. So organisms more and more complicated and also more and more differentiated are born of the association of organisms barely differentiated and elementary. In this extreme form, the theory is open to grave objections, and more the idea seems to be gaining ground that polyzoism is an exceptional and abnormal fact. But it is nonetheless true that things happen as if every higher organism was born of an association of cells that have subdivided the work between them. Very probably it is not the cells that have made the individual by means of association, it is rather the individual that has made the cells by means of dissociation. But this itself reveals to us in the genesis of the individual a haunting of the social form, as if the individual could develop only on the condition that its substance should be split up into elements having themselves an appearance of individuality and united among themselves by an appearance of sociality. There are numerous cases in which nature seems to hesitate between the two forms and to ask herself if she shall make a society or an individual. The slightest push is enough then to make the balance weigh on one side or the other. If we take an infusorian sufficiently large, such as the stentor, and cut it into two halves, each containing a part of the nucleus, each of the two halves will generate an independent stentor. But if we divide it incompletely, so that protoplasmic communication is left between the two halves, we shall see them execute, each from its side, corresponding movements, so that in this case it is enough that a thread should be maintained or cut in order that life should affect the social or the individual form. Thus, in rudimentary organisms consisting of a single cell, we already find the apparent individuality of the whole is the composition of an undefined number of potential individualities potentially associated. But from top to bottom of the series of living beings, the same law is manifested, and it is that It is this that we express when we say that unity and multiplicity are categories of inert matter, and that the vital impetus is neither pure unity nor pure multiplicity, and that if the matter to which it communicates itself compels it to choose one of the two, its choice will never be definitive. It will leap from one to the other indefinitely. The evolution of life in the double direction of individuality and association has therefore nothing accidental about it. It is due to the very nature of life. Essential also is the progress to reflection. If our analysis is correct, it is consciousness, or rather supraconsciousness, that is at the origin of life. Consciousness or supraconsciousness is the name for the rocket whose extinguished fragments fall back as matter. Consciousness, again, is the name for that which subsists of the rocket itself, passing through the fragments and lighting them up into organisms. But this consciousness, which is a need of creation, is made manifest to itself only where creation is possible. It lies dormant when life is condemned to automatism. It wakens as soon as possibility of a choice is restored. That is why in organisms unprovided with a nervous system, it varies according to the power of locomotion and of deformation of which the organism disposes. And in animals with a nervous system, it is proportional to the complexity of the switchboard on which the paths called sensory and the paths called motor intersect, that is, of the brain. How must this solidarity between the organism and consciousness be understood? We will not dwell on it here, on a point that we have dealt with in former works. Let us merely recall a theory such as that according to which consciousness is attached to certain neurons and is thrown off from their work like a phosphorescence, may be accepted by the scientist for the detail of analysis. It is a convenient mode of expression, but it is nothing else. In reality, a living being is a center of action, represents a certain sum of contingency entering into the world, that is to say, a certain quantity of possible action, a quantity variable with individuals and especially with species. The nervous system of an animal marks out the inflexible lines on which its action will run, although the potential energy is accumulated in the muscles rather than in the nervous system itself. Its nervous centers indicate by their development and their configuration the more or less extended choice it will have among more or less numerous and complicated actions. Now, since the awakening of consciousness in a living creature is the more complete, the greater the latitude of choice allowed to it and the larger the amount of action bestowed upon it, it is clear that the development of consciousness will appear to be dependent on that of the nervous centers. On the other hand, every state of consciousness being in one aspect of it a question put to the motor activity and even the beginning of a reply, there is no psychical event that does not imply the entry into play of the cortical mechanisms. Everything seems therefore to happen as if consciousness sprang from the brain, and as if the detail of conscious activity were modeled on that of the cerebral activity. In reality, consciousness does not spring from the brain, but brain and consciousness correspond because equally they measure, the one by the complexity of its structure and the other by the intensity of its awareness, the quantity of choice that the living being has at its disposal. It is precisely because a cerebral state expresses simply what is there of nascent action in the corresponding psychical state that the psychical state tells us more than the cerebral state. Consciousness of a living being, as we have tried to prove elsewhere, is inseparable from its brain in the sense in which a sharp knife is inseparable from its edge. The brain is the sharp edge by which consciousness cuts into the compact tissue of events, but the brain is no more coextensive with consciousness than the edge is with the knife. Thus, from the fact that two brains, like that of the ape and that of the man, are very much alike, we cannot conclude that the corresponding consciousnesses are comparable or commensurable. But the two brains may perhaps be less alike than we suppose. I'm going to leave it right there since we're getting kind of late. We're at page 263. We're talking about the meaning of evolution, and we will pick it up next time with part 9. See you then.